All right.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Annie Carforo, and I am the Climate Justice Campaign Coordinator at We Act for Environmental Justice. I'm really glad that you're joining us today for our webinar, Too Hot to Handle, the reality of extreme heat in New York and how to prepare frontline communities. So as LJ's mentioned, yesterday it was 95 degrees. It felt hotter in many places. Which means another heat season is upon us. And so that's really, the perfect time for We Act to kick off our extreme heat awareness campaign, which is the goal of the purpose of this webinar today. And this is going to include, a lot of really great information as well as policy reforms that are going to better prepare frontline communities or environmental justice communities for our new reality when it comes to extreme heat. So we're hoping that during this webinar, participants, you'll be able to gain an understanding of extreme heat through the lens of environmental racism and really see how extreme heat is a major environmental justice issue. Understand the causes and impacts, especially the health impacts of extreme heat. We're going to be identifying some community-driven solutions to mitigate the impacts of extreme heat. And finally, we're really grateful that we have so many great minds in the same space. And so we hope to continue this collaboration among stakeholders. So we have a packed agenda, so I'm going to run through this really quickly, but we are going to just do a little introduction to We Act. We have a great lineup of speakers from the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, from Columbia Climate School, NYCHA, the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice, and the Comptroller's Office. And we'll finish off the webinar introducing We Act's 2021 Cooling Center report, as well as our 2022 Extreme Heat Plan, which will all be linked and you'll be able to look at post-webinar. So a little bit about We Act. For those of you that might not know us, We Act for Environmental Justice is a community-based organization based in Harlem. And we've been fighting environmental racism since 1988 at the city, state, and federal levels. So we are advocating to remedy the negative cumulative impacts of unjust policies that have plagued communities of color and low-income communities for decades by building power among residents in Northern Manhattan so that they have a say in the environmental health policies and practices that impact their lives. One issue that we organize and advocate for are adaptation and mitigation measures related to extreme heat. We know that because of climate change, New York City summers are getting hotter and the heat is lasting longer. And we also know that, as we'll get into later in the presentation, that heat is felt differently across the city, and it often depends on your zip code. So that's why We Act has started the Heat, Health, and Equity Initiative, which is a 3-year program to find solutions to extreme heat and the forces of inequity that make heat more dangerous in our community. So many of the objectives and the recommendations in our heat plan that you'll hear about today are the culmination of a community-led engagement process around extreme heat. And we aim to collaborate with city and state agencies to make the policies we name a reality. So we're really grateful for everyone here today, and I'm going to pass it over to Sonal.
Thank you so much, Annie. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. We're very excited to finally host this webinar. Extreme heat is one of the main climate issues that our organization works in because it has such a direct impact on the communities that we represent, as Annie explained. And it is not an issue that impacts everyone equally. And that's why we're really focused on extreme heat. And we'll get into all the details from all of our speakers as to why that is and what the solutions we want to see are. But first, I'd like to just do a quick framing before I hand it over to our heat experts. First of all, heat waves, they're increasing in severity, frequency, and duration. And this is what was reported by the NPCC, which is the New York City Panel on Climate Change, and the IPCC, which is our more broader global reporters on climate change, that have found that all of the research over a long period of time have found that extreme heat is getting so much worse in these 3 ways. So severity, meaning that the hot days are hotter and more brutal. The frequency is that our heat waves are happening much more often. And then duration is that they're actually lasting for longer periods of time. So now we have 3-day heat waves or 4-day heat waves, and it really impacts the health of people. And that's why we're here today. And that's why we're so concerned about it. Next slide. So the other reason why we are especially concerned about heat waves in New York City is because we have the urban heat island effect, which is the idea that because we live in a city with a lot of concrete, a lot of spaces for heat to sort of get trapped into, that we have higher than average temperatures compared to like a more suburban area or rural area that has a lot more vegetation, has all of their buildings a little bit more spread out and has less sort of industrial sources that create heat. So not only is extreme heat getting worse just because of climate change, which is a major concern, but also because in a city we're impacted much more. And so we see on average, there's been between 1.8 and 5.4 degrees Celsius warmer on average in a city than its surroundings. But that also is just a general overview. We will get much more into how there are disparities that are bigger in different parts of the city and why that might be, and why this is a major environmental justice issue. And therefore it's something that We ACT is very, very focused on. Next slide. Yes, so just quickly before we hand it over to our heat health experts, the main reason why we're concerned about extreme heat is because it hurts health. There's a huge connection between exposure to heat and all of these different health impacts. It goes from dehydration, which I think we all are familiar with, all the way to heat strokes, which can lead to death. You get increased hospitalizations, emergency room visits from it, and people with existing chronic illnesses tend to be have more health impacts from extreme heat. So if you have asthma, for example, then you might be affected more. We have members that say they don't even really go outside on a really hot day if they have asthma because they can't walk more than a block before having a lot of trouble breathing. So this is a big concern for us, is if we're having so many days over 90 degrees or just days that feel incredibly hot, how are people coping? How are people dealing with this impact? How is their health impacted, and what can we do to protect people? So that's really what we're talking about today. Next slide. So I'm not going to go over the health impacts too much because we have two experts here who are going to do that. I'd love to call up Dr. Lauren Smalls-Manti and Katie Lane from the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene here in New York City, and they do a lot of amazing research on heat health impacts. So I will hand it over to them.
Okay, thank you very much, Sonal. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, great. I'm going to share my screen. And I will start things off and then pass it over to my colleague, Lauren. Let me just make sure. Okay. Okay, great. So I just wanted to first thank you all so much for inviting us to this event. Lauren and I, as Sonal mentioned, are going to talk about heat and health in the city, as well as some heat tools and resources for staying safe. And so unfortunately, we know that on average, extreme heat is the deadliest type of extreme weather event in the United States, and that's also true here in New York City. And here, at the health department, we track heat-related deaths in two ways. We look at heat stroke deaths, where heat-related illness like heat exhaustion or hypothermia leads to somebody's death, and heat is marked as a cause of death on their death certificate. We also use statistical models to estimate the number of heat exacerbated deaths, which happen when heat exacerbates somebody's chronic conditions like a heart disease or kidney disease, and that can also lead to death. And each year, unfortunately, hot weather results in the deaths of 350 New Yorkers. And this is both due to extreme heat days and hot but not extreme heat days. So about 100 of those deaths are associated with the hottest days of the year, which are fewer in number, but very dangerous. And the rest are associated with temperatures where we see a daily maximum of over 82 degrees Fahrenheit. We also have on average 10 heat strokes deaths every year, as well as about 600 hospital admissions and ED visits for heat-related illnesses. And also, in addition to those heat-related illnesses, heat can again exacerbate chronic conditions, and it may not result in a death, but it does tend to increase hospital visits for heart, respiratory, mental health, and kidney conditions. When we look at the circumstances of exposure for people who die of heat stroke, because we are able to review in depth the death records, we see that the primary risk environment is in hot, unair-conditioned homes. And we also see that there is a racial disparity and inequity in how those deaths are felt in the city, with Black New Yorkers being more likely to die from heat stroke, with death rates about 2 times as high. And this is an inequity that's, it's caused by past and current structural racism. It's not biologically based. It's due to systems like economic, educational, healthcare, housing systems that actively disadvantage people of color. And the health department has also put together a heat vulnerability index with colleagues at Columbia University that shows differences in impacts at the community level, because we know that some communities are more impacted by heat than others. The heat vulnerability index includes race, air conditioning, prevalence, income, service temperature in the neighborhood, and access to green space, which is protective. And neighborhoods with higher heat vulnerability index scores feel the greatest impacts during and immediately after extreme heat events. And again, we see that neighborhoods that are home to people of color and people with fewer financial resources are more impacted. And again, these inequities that we see are driven by structural racism. And that's a system that interacts in a lot of different ways to drive that risk. So I think others are going to discuss other aspects of the city's heat health programming, but I just wanted to mention a few efforts here, one of which are important parts of the city's extreme heat response, one of which is the Be a Buddy program, which I think one of my colleagues is going to discuss in more detail, but it's a community connectedness and outreach program that DOH&H runs in partnership with 3 community-based organizations and high HVI neighborhoods. And the Get Cool NYC program, which was an emergency response program in 2020 in response to the twin threats of extreme heat and COVID-19, and the New York City Emergency Management coordinated a very large city effort to install about 73,000 home air conditioners for lower income older adults. So, at this time, the city was also able to successfully secure a small utility bill credit for low income customers to help them with the cost of running the air conditioners. But as we expand access to air conditioning, we do need to make sure that the grid is prepared and that people can actually afford to run their air conditioners, because we know that this is a major challenge for folks. There are some programs that can help with this. The New York State Home Energy Assistance Program, also called HEAP, which is funded through the federal government, sets aside money to help people pay for air conditioners. But of course, it would be great, and we would like to see that assistance expand to include summer utility bill coverage to help folks with the cost of air conditioners. And we also know that, as we're talking about challenges in paying for cooling, that people have a lot of different priorities, and dealing with hot weather is just one of them, and it may not be a top priority. that energy is really needed for lots of aspects of well-being. This slide shows some of the responses that we had to a survey that we did in 2020, where we asked, in partnership with WeAct, where we asked some lower income New York City residents about the impacts of cutting back on electricity due to cost. And as you can see, it really, there are a lot of, it can have a lot of negative impacts on sleep quality, on stress levels and mood and health conditions. And it also involves trade-offs and other things that people can afford, like food and medicine. And it's important, that we help people with energy costs, as well as making public cooling center options available so that people have lots of options to deal with hot weather. Okay, and now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Warren.
Hi, so while you're thinking about staying cool, and as Katie mentioned, we realize that everyone has many priorities in life, but we do want to help you to make an informed decision about heat where you live. So these are just a couple bullet points that you should think about this summer, even though it seems like we already started our extreme heat season, but this webinar is very timely, we'll say that. So first, know about your neighborhood. And so I'm gonna go through later in the presentation some of the resources where you can learn about your neighborhood through the data that New York City Health provides that we collect with other agencies. And so there's one, our health and data portal, and our Cool It NYC website, which will also be discussed later in this webinar through the Parks Department. And in general, you need to make a heat plan for the summer. So Katie talked about the Be a Buddy, and again, we'll go more into detail later in the webinar about the Be a Buddy program. And New York City also has cooling centers that are open only during extreme heat, but of course, that will be discussed later on today. And third, you want to utilize the resources to help adapt your home to the summer heat. So as Katie mentioned, we did have the emergency Get Cool program. Although New York City is not running that again, we do have funding. There is funding that you can apply to get things like ACs or energy assistance for your home. And again, that will also be talked about later. And just wanted to mention the one-shot deal cash energy assistance if you really need some help. Next slide, please. So next slide. Okay, great. All right, so this is our New York City Health and Data portal, which is provided, which you can go through the link above. And on this data portal, you can see a lot of the data that we're collecting in our neighborhoods. So if you want quick information, you can go to our neighborhood reports, and I'll show you what that looks like. If you want a bigger picture or whole concept stories on like heat or air quality in your neighborhood, you can go to the data stories. Or if you're a data nerd and really want to see all the data and really want to explore how different data interacts with each other, you can go to our Explore data page, where we have many indicators that will help you to make a more informed decision about your heat plans this summer. Next slide, please. So this is our neighborhood report, and this is for the Morning Heights, Central Harlem area. And so on our neighborhood reports, we have many things such as the average concentrations of ozone, surface temperature, how many heat ED visits you have. And basically this compares your neighborhoods to an average, and you can see the ranking of where your neighborhood falls in that zone. So maybe if you have a high ozone neighborhood, when we have high heat days, that should be taken into account, because we know that ozone increases as on most high heat days. Next slide, please. Yes, thank you. And then we have our data stories, which really give a whole picture concept of either urban heat or air quality and how that affects our daily lives. So if you want to learn how how temperature changes in your neighborhood, what influences temperatures in your neighborhood, you can go to our data story, Urban Heat Island Effect in New York City. We have an extreme heat quiz, so you can learn what ways how to adapt your home to heat in New York City, and make sure you know all of the information that you need to know regarding heat, so there's no misunderstandings. Next slide, please. And this is an example of one of our data stories. So in this picture, we're comparing two neighborhoods, one with vegetation and one without vegetation. You can look to see how different land use, such as building materials or vegetation, affects your neighborhoods. And it has some things that you can play with in the data story. So you can advocate for, say, more trees in your neighborhood, or the use of better materials that aren't as hot in your neighborhood. Next slide, please. So New York City Health Department also collects real-time data and static data. So one of the static data pieces that we collected, we for 2 years monitored air temperature in New York City neighborhoods in medium to high HVI zones. And so that data is available in our data story in the top right-hand corner, and we had monitors. So if you see the monitors out, they're not cameras. They're just collecting temperature. They don't even link back to us. So those are the two right-hand corner pictures. And you can see that the distribution of temperature in neighborhoods changes. You can see the color changes from pink to yellow to purple throughout the neighborhoods, and that's the temperature variation. So you can learn about that. And new this year, we're also able to show real-time air quality data. So you can see for a day like May 21st, which was our really first hot weekend during one of the marathons, you can see how ozone, which really spiked in the neighborhoods. So you can look at that. And if you have asthma or other related illnesses that are affected by air quality, you can make a plan. Next slide, please. So if you need more information, this is the link to the New York City Health and Data portal. Thank you.
Great. Thank you guys so much for that information. We really appreciate it, Katie and Lauren. We're going to go ahead and move to the next bit here, and that would be me. Give me 1 second here while I set everything up. There we go. All right, sorry, technical difficulties in this age of Zoom, still figuring this all out. Okay, there you go. Slideshow. Okay, everyone can see my screen, right? Thumbs up quickly. Okay, cool. All right, so what we're going to do is kind of transition a little bit, and we're going to talk a little bit of how extreme heat, what it looks like through the lens of environmental justice and environmental racism, and why it's an environmental justice issue. So we kind of look at it this simple framework here, where we have kind of three components here. We have environmental racism, environmental justice, and climate justice. So environmental racism is racial discrimination in environmental policies, usually where there's targeting of polluting facilities within communities of color. And there's a lot of environmental inequity and injustice done with some of these racist policies. So a lot of people will assume, will think that that some of these things are by accident or by chance, and they're not. So a lot of the environmental racist policies and things that we see and that we experience are because they were designed that way. So the great example for extreme heat is a racist housing policy, past racist policy was redlining. And what redlining did was basically decided which neighborhoods were desirable and not desirable based on how many people of color lived in that neighborhood. So if more people of color lived in that neighborhood, they were less desirable. And so that caused less investment and less development in those areas. And that kind of lives on today and trickles down. And so now you have neighborhoods that have been historically disinvested in. And so the environmental justice aspect of that is basically, it's the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, particularly people of color, people who've been disproportionately impacted by environmental racist policies, and kind of this distribution of the environmental benefits. So when it comes to extreme heat, a great example of environmental justice is making sure that everyone is at the table and kind of having these kind of conversations. Communities of color are able to reinvest, get money for investment for back into their communities. So you want the equitable distribution of some of the mitigation efforts that come with extreme heat. So for instance, if we are doing a tree planting program, or putting more trees or more green infrastructure, we want to make sure that those trees and that infrastructure goes to the places that need it the most first. And that is kind of the equity component. And that would be an example of an environmental justice aspect to a program or policy. And at WEACT, we routinely look for environmental justice in all policies, particularly in environmental and climate policies as well. And in climate justice is the collective movement, right, to address kind of the climate crisis and the equitable way that was just talked about, and making sure that everyone has an equitable share of the solutions, and to make sure that the solutions are also coming from the communities that are impacted the most. And the reason why this kind of framework is important is to really understand that the reason why we experience heat disproportionately throughout the city is because of the factors of environmental racism and what we're trying to do and achieve, and to mitigate those impacts of extreme heat due to climate change. We do it through the lens of environmental and climate justice. And just to kind of give you an example of how these policies continue today, some of these racist policies from the past continue into today. We have an example here of East Harlem versus the Upper West Side, right? So it's 31 degrees solid surface temperature in East Harlem than it is on the Upper West Side, a typical Upper West Side street. And if you look at these photos here, you can see the stark difference there between the two streets that are in the neighborhood. You have basically no tree cover at all in East Harlem compared to a completely tree-lined street with a lot of green space in the Upper West Side. And so these are recent photos. So these are as of like our current time. So these aren't past photos. So it just kind of goes to illustrates how past racist policies can still invade today. And we're going to kind of continue the kind of equity conversation. We have Dr. Liv Yoon here, who's a policy analyst at Health Canada, but she was formerly a postdoctoral researcher at the Columbia Climate School. And she's going to talk about addressing the urban heat island effects through the equity lens and community science project. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to invite Dr. Liv Yoon to come up and speak to us.
Great, thank you, Lonnie. Let me start sharing my screen. I assume you can all hear me okay. Great, thank you. Okay. Can you see the presentation and not my notes? I've done a full presentation once with the notes, so thank you. All right, that's a great segue, and I realized watching the first two presentations that the first bit of my presentation is redundant, so I'll skip through quickly. So I'm going to talk mainly about the project that I led while at the Columbia Climate School on heat mapping, and this was a community science project, and the focus of it was very much on heat equity. And when I say heat equity, I mean the disparities associated with heat, so health and also the longstanding and current forms of discrimination and systemic racism that have contributed to this and continue to contribute and also exacerbate heat-related problems. So Sonal went through what urban heat island effect is, so I'll skip that quickly. It's the phenomenon of cities being hotter than surrounding rural or suburban areas due to reasons like asphalt, concrete, brick, dark roofs and pavement, so high temperatures being absorbed, and tall buildings being densely together, high traffic and carbon emitting infrastructure being concentrated in these areas because it's highly populated, and of course many people using energy. And here's what that looks like in New York City. And I think Katie and Lauren also went through this, but these are some stark numbers that that stood out to us. So on average, since 2010, about 130 New Yorkers die from heat-related causes per year. And 50% of these deaths are in New York City's Black communities, even though they only make a quarter of the population. So that's a stark difference. And if we just continue on our current trend, then up to 3,300 people per year could die by 2080 from extreme heat-related causes. But an important fact is, like someone said earlier, that some neighborhoods are way more affected than others by heat. And here is what that looks like. And Lonnie just showed photos as well. So here's the Upper East Side. So you see a lot of tree canopy and the resulting shade. Compare that to the South Bronx, for example. So I'm going to show examples from the South Bronx as well as Upper Manhattan, because that's where our project was based. So you see that there aren't many trees, and it's a lot of pavement, it's a lot of roads, and it's a lot of traffic. And also in West Harlem, this is 130th and Broadway. I just lived 5 blocks north of here. And yeah, as you know, if you live around here, similar to the South Bronx, very, very, very traffic heavy, not many trees. And it's a stark difference from the Upper West Side, which is not that far away. So this is a heat vulnerability index map, which Katie showed a more recent version of. So I'll skip this quickly as well. But the more vulnerable you are, so the neighborhoods are scored from 1 to 5, 5 being the highest risk. And they're assessed on 4 things considered the most important social and environmental factors that contribute to heat risk. So surface temperature and percentage of residents who are low income, and possession of air conditioning, and also access to green space. So the darker the color here, the more heat vulnerable the neighborhood. And New York City is a really useful case to explore the urban heat island effect and just extreme heat and the associated inequities in general, because there are such stark differences, even within such a small geographical area. And this shows that there are other factors at play besides, the physical characteristics of spaces like density and height of buildings and color of rooftops, which are often considered the main contributors of urban heat island effect. So New York City, in other words, is a prime case to demonstrate the intersecting and the compounding and cascading issues that both contribute to and exacerbate extreme heat related risks. So, the health risks don't only come from geographical and physical characteristics of buildings, but it also has to do with systemic racism and historic zoning laws and other axes of social inequities that will contribute to this and exacerbate it. So onto our project. The main goal was literally to map heat, to make it visible and its disproportionate impacts. So our campaign was part of a multi-year nationwide campaign, which was led by the National Integrated Heat Health Information System, which is an initiative of NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and the CDC, Center for Disease Control and Prevention. And we also partnered with Kappa Strategies in Oregon, who were the providers of the technology for this. So New York was one of the 12 cities participating in last year's mapping campaign. And we really aim to get a more granular look at the urban heat island effect, because yes, cities are hot, but the point is that even within the same city, there are stark differences between neighborhoods. And this was in partnership with South Bronx Unite, which was our community partner organization. And I'll talk more about the community science focus, but they were absolutely instrumental in making this more relevant to the people actually affected by the heat. And also I will note that Sonal was of immense help in the grant writing process. So thank you for that, Sonal. And okay, so how does our data differ from the existing heat maps? Because we have seen different maps and we've seen satellite images showing how heat is distributed. But first, the way in which our data differs from existing is that our campaign measured ambient temperature. So previous models have been based on satellite data, which record the temperature of the ground itself, so the surface temperature. But our campaign measured air temperatures and humidity close to the ground. So that's actually the heat that people feel. And ours has much finer spatial resolution. So it's about 1 meter to 10 meters. So this is a lot finer than most public satellite products, which is about 30 meters to a kilometer. And this granularity is what we were aiming for because they're much more conducive to designing targeted local mitigation efforts. And what we did was real-time mobile data collection across several different locations. So while most existing air temperature is collected in stationary location, ours, we had 12 different routes, and I'll go into this on the next slide. We had 12 different routes and people going 3 times a day, all at the same time. So that leads to my last point. So data were collected multiple times in the day. So morning, afternoon, and evening. So 6 to 7 a.m., 3 to 4 p.m., and 7 to 8 p.m. to capture how heat may vary throughout the day. Because we know that it's not just an afternoon problem. In fact, it's very much a night problem for people who are affected by indoor heat, which is very much an issue, and I'll get to that later as well. And the photo is one of the base camps that we had where community scientists could come to collect their equipment. And this is at Maria Sola Park in the South Bronx. And our Northern Manhattan base was in Riverside Park. So how this happened, to give you a sense of the timeline. So we first partnered with the local community group South Bronx Unite. And I had already had a relationship with them from previous work that I'd done for my postdoc. So we also knew that Northern Manhattan and the South Bronx areas were hotter areas based on existing literature and also from data from New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. I also knew that they were doing things around advocating for more green space along their waterfront. So this was a good fit, a natural good fit. We also reached out to other environmental justice groups, though, including WeAct and also community boards in the areas of our subject area, so community boards 9 to 12, to tell us which are specific areas of concern. So specific, corridors of activity, whether that be an intersection, near a grocery store that people go to, because we wanted to pick areas that are of interest to people who, we're not just going to go measure a park if it's somewhere that people don't frequent. So we collected these points in collaboration with different groups, and then we gave these points to CAPA Strategies, who then designed the traverse routes. And then in conversation with NOAA and the National Weather Service, we picked a date that qualified as an extreme heat event. And this happened to be July 24th, 2021, last summer. And then on data collection day, there were 12 different routes, and one of them was a cycling route. So people would go out in pairs in cars. So one of them was a navigator, one of them was driving. And then we had a sensor attached to the car window, and it was an hour-long route. So, and they would do this 3 times a day. So at 6 a.m., for example, there would be 9 pairs going on 9 different driving routes, and 1 cyclist and 2 other walking routes. And then we would repeat this twice more. So overall, 3 times a day. And overall, all of this yielded in 42,386 data points collected, which then went to CAPA to give us, I'll show you the maps later, but they produced the maps based on those points that we gave them. And this is what the sensors look like. So these are called type T thermocouples, which I have been told is just a fancy term for temperature sensor. And they fired off every second to capture block by block differences. Oh, that should not say what, in temperature and humidity. Sorry about that. And all the community scientists had to do was just turn it on. It was pretty self-explanatory. And again, we really could not have done this without the community scientists. So we thankfully had additional funding from the Earth Institute, now known as Columbia Climate School, to compensate our community scientists. We also were able to compensate South Bronx Unite as our community partner because the time is very, very valuable for everyone. We certainly didn't want to just poach data from people. And this was labor, you know, you had to get up in early morning for some people. This was an hour-long route 3 times a day. And we also knew that this was important because, I mean, any environmental justice research, any climate justice research, it has to include people who are disproportionately impacted. It doesn't make sense otherwise. And, you know, it also made good sense, like good research sense, because people who are affected and who live in these areas, they know better. And, you know, they might have information that we cannot get just from surveying maps online. So, for example, this came up multiple times actually. We can look at a Google map and count the number of parks in an area, but what some residents told us that some of these parks are pretty useless. You know, they're just concrete slabs with a swing set on it. So it doesn't do much for shade. It doesn't do much for just refuge from heat. So this is the type of qualitative data that only locals have access to that we were able to benefit from as researchers. So it was very, very important that they were involved. So these are the maps that we got from Kaplan Strategies. So as you can see, Northern Manhattan, the South Bronx are definitely hotter than the Upper West Side, Central Park, obviously, and the Upper East Side. So our project area was from 59th Street and up, and then near Yankee Stadium in the Bronx. The one thing I will note is that in the morning, you see that the Upper East Side was hotter or just as hot as Northern Manhattan or the South Bronx. And they said, Kappa Strategies told us that this has to do with the inversion effect off the East River in the morning, and that often happens. But what's important to remember here is that even if heat is behaving this way, people in the Upper East Side or more affluent, whiter areas are more likely to have buffers against extreme heat. So they're more likely to live in climate-controlled houses, work in climate-controlled offices, you know, have access to good healthcare. So even if we see heat distribution that might not fit our prediction, it's important to remember the buffers, the socioeconomic buffers that protects one against extreme heat. But you see that for the afternoon and the evening, the trend very much holds where, you know, the Upper Manhattan areas and the South Bronx are much hotter than the more affluent white areas of New York City. So the thing is, we already know which parts are hotter. You know, even before, you know, I use the word prediction because we already knew which parts would be hotter. But the trouble is, the parts that are hotter also tend to be poorer neighborhoods with more people of color, and this is why the justice focus is important, and as Lonnie mentioned too, the environmental justice approach. So not only is there inadequate infrastructure, like more traffic and less green space, all the built environment factors that contribute to heat. People who live in these areas, the hotter areas, also have way fewer buffers against extreme heat. So they're more likely to work outside, not have access to air conditioning. They're more likely to be in public housing that are known to absorb and retain heat. And they're more likely to have pre-existing health conditions that make them more vulnerable to heat stress and also make them less likely to recover from it. And on top of all of this, they are also less likely to have access to healthcare. So all of these overlaps, this is not a coincidence. And this is one of the main aims of our project, to connect the dots here among social inequities and extreme heat and all these health disparities to ask the question, you know, why are some populations in New York City rendered more vulnerable to all these risks? You know, what's the link here between different bodies, health, and the social and political and historical context and sets of discrimination? So now I'll show you a series of these different socio-environmental and historical factors that contribute to and exacerbate the disproportionate impact of extreme heat on people already marginalized along race and class lines. So one example that Lonnie also referred to is redlining. So this is a residential security map from the Homeowners Loan Corporation, where they coded in red areas that were deemed high risk, which namely just meant Black neighborhoods that they wouldn't give out mortgage credit to. And these red line communities, again, remain to this day low to moderate income communities of color, and they're underserved in resources, including green spaces. And compare that to the heat vulnerability index map. So look at the areas that are red on the red line map and the HVI map on the right. So you see very much an overlap here, and this is not a coincidence. Another example is income. So here the colors are reversed. On the left, you have the median household income map, where the darker the color, the more affluent the area. So you see that the lighter areas, which is more concentrated in Northern Manhattan and the South Bronx, are also the hotter areas. And that's, again, it's not surprising, not a coincidence. And this is a headline from the New York Times just 2 days ago. I mean, they put it pretty bluntly, which I think is effective. It's going to be a hot summer, and it will be hotter if you are not rich. Oops. And health disparities.
Just a quick time check, Liv. Sorry.
Yes.
I know you're giving me great information now. Just a quick time check.
Thank you. No, I appreciate that. Yeah. Okay. So again, diabetes and hypertension are two of the prominent health conditions that make heat-related stress worse. So again, darker areas, hotter areas, you see the overlap. So you see what I'm getting at, an AC possession. I know that also WEACT and the NRDC did a collaborative report on looking at more the nuances of AC use. So, it doesn't mean that just because you have AC that you are going to use it, because, it might be broken or your landlord has control of it. So there's more detail to this that is worth looking into. And then asthma, this is an especially big problem for the South Bronx, which is known as Asthma Alley, due to having one of the highest child asthma rates in the country. And I think Lauren mentioned this, heat plus smog, so air pollution, is deadly. And again, this is not a coincidence that this is concentrated in areas like the South Bronx. The South Bronx has more advocacy efforts these days for calling for more green space and blue space along their waterfront, which would help not only for air pollution, but obviously for mitigating heat as well. So there are co-benefits to addressing extreme heat. Lastly, I will end with this. So we are making a story map to connect all the dots that I just mentioned. So the socio-historic inequities, as well as extreme heat and the health disparities. But we really want to feature personal stories, and because data itself, putting a human face to data is really helpful. So I'll send an email to this to Lonnie after, so maybe we can get your help spreading it. But yeah, we're giving out prizes also for some testimonies. So yeah, I hope you can contribute. Thank you very much.
Thank you
Sorry
so much, Liv.
Going over time.
No, it's okay. It's such great information, and it's really important to understand kind of like that deep level kind of surface understanding, especially using community-based organizations. So we really do appreciate that and the work that you've been doing. We're going to move on quickly here, because I know I want to be mindful of everyone's time, but I'm going to ask that Siobhan Watson kind of come up from New York Housing Authority, NYCHA. She's going to talk to us a little bit about what's going on in NYCHA and the work that they're going to be doing to kind of mitigate extreme heat.
All right, thank you, Lonnie. Great to see everybody's presentations here. Just give me a second. I'm going to start sharing my screen. Okay, is everybody seeing this? Great. So my name is Siobhan Watson. I'm the Deputy Director of Sustainability Programs at the New York City Housing Authority. As many of you, I'm sure, know, NYCHA is New York City's public housing authority. NYCHA has 335 individual developments, over 2,000 buildings. If NYCHA were its own city, it would have a population larger than Las Vegas, Atlanta, Miami, and has some of those aspects of high heat vulnerability that we saw from the presenters before. NYCHA is actually home to 1 in 15 New Yorkers, and is a really essential place to focus on heat vulnerability and mitigating those risks as we experience more extreme heat. So NYCHA is also working hard to correct, decades of disinvestment in public housing and raise housing quality standards across its portfolio. There are a variety of programs aimed at rehabilitating NYCHA buildings. As we do that, it is really important to think about the climate that is going to exist in the time span in which these rehabilitations are taking effect. So heat is one of the major things that we're looking at. We're also looking at increased vulnerability to coastal storm surge and rain-driven flooding at NYCHA developments as well. Over the past couple of years, we put together a climate adaptation plan to outline several goals related to mitigating the effects of climate change for NYCHA residents, and how we will build climate resiliency into the housing quality upgrades that are going to be taking place across NYCHA's portfolio. And many of those goals are related to extreme heat. So the first one of those that is very closely related to the threat of heat is our goal to foster the health of NYCHA's urban forest. We heard about the importance of green space to the intensity of the urban heat island effect. NYCHA is actually home to 1,000 acres of tree canopy. This is an image of tree canopy in a couple of neighborhoods where there are high concentrations of NYCHA developments. And as you can see, in neighborhoods with lower tree canopy overall, NYCHA developments are resources, are real places where the tree canopy cover in those neighborhoods is concentrated. So they are a cooling resource, not only for NYCHA residents, but for the neighborhood as a whole, to provide those kind of concentrations of vegetation in neighborhoods where NYCHA developments exist. Lauren talked about Lauren and Katie talked about the monitoring of temperatures as part of the Cool Neighborhoods initiative. NYCHA worked with DOHMH to install heat sensors inside NYCHA developments and just outside of them. And from that research, we were able to see the difference in temperature inside a NYCHA development with high tree canopy cover and outside of it. And we saw a difference of a couple degrees on a hot day, which makes a difference to how it feels to experience that environment. So as part of our climate adaptation work, we're focusing on strategizing to elevate tree care, protect the trees that we have, especially as more construction happens on NYCHA campuses, and try to make sure that we preserve that resource and protect the cooling effects that NYCHA trees have on their within the developments and for the neighborhood. So part of what we've been doing here is working in partnership with Green City Force. So it's an AmeriCorps jobs training program that recruits exclusively NYCHA residents to develop tree programming. We have a team of Green City Forest alums that has been working to develop a complete tree inventory at NYCHA campuses, and we're working to build more tree care into that programming in partnership with Green City Forest too, as well as elevating NYCHA's own operational care of its trees. However, we know that passive strategies on their own are not enough to provide protection against extreme heat for NYCHA residents. So another important aspect of our efforts to address extreme heat is to expand access to reliable and efficient cooling in NYCHA apartments. This has been done in a variety of ways. Historically, no public housing authority has traditionally provided cooling as an amenity in public housing. NYCHA worked a few years ago to really look closely at whether that was something that was a rule or it was just common practice, and found that there was actually no prohibition on public housing authorities providing cooling. So NYCHA sustainability programs and Energy Department launched a couple of pilot initiatives to provide NYCHA provided cooling to residents for the first time. One of those pilots installed smart networked air conditioners at a senior building throughout the entire building. They're NYCHA owned units. And the idea there was to install more efficient units and provide them to residents at no charge to kind of try to reduce energy use through greater efficiency while achieving universal cooling in the apartments. Another effort was to install air source heat pumps in several apartments in Fort Independence in the Bronx. And that was a smaller pilot. It only focused on 7 apartments, and it was really to look at what can NYCHA achieve with existing technology in terms of converting to air source heat pump based heating and cooling. So those pilots yielded some important information. I'll just mention, the Get Cool program in 2020 was brought up earlier. So NYCHA also participated in that program, worked to install over 16,000 air conditioners for vulnerable residents at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, as the summer heat was starting to combine with the threat of COVID to potentially have large effects on residents. So over 16,000 air conditioners were installed for NYCHA residents without an existing air conditioner, who were older than 60 or had a mobility impairment or other special need. So the cooling pilots have yielded some important results. The most important for the air source heat pump pilot being that it is extremely expensive to retrofit NYCHA apartments with off-the-shelf technology that exists right now. It involves multiple entries to the apartment, multiple skilled trades, testing and inspections, and long runs of piping that require multiple penetrations through the walls. So it is just an extremely expensive retrofit to do with existing technology. So NYCHA's energy department has been working with NYCHA and NYPA to work to develop a scalable solution that can more cost effectively be installed in NYCHA apartments. So the idea is to reduce the cost of switching from a steam heating system to a heating and cooling air source heat pump system. There has been a challenge released. It's called the Clean Heat for All Challenge. And the idea behind this is to inspire manufacturers to develop a new air source heat pump that is easily installable at NYCHA developments. There's been a lot of interest from not only manufacturers in kind of repackaging existing technology, but from other users that may be interested in this. So other public housing authorities, government agencies, et cetera. So that challenge is ongoing. NYCHA has worked to issue an RFP for bulk purchase. So it would sort of encourage manufacturers to produce this product by promising to buy a large number of them if it meets these specifications. And NYCHA expects to announce the winners of this initial round of the challenge in the coming months. Another effort that we have been undertaking is really just treating heat as a hazard. And I think, as you heard from our fellow presenters, heat is one of the most dangerous aspects of climate change for New Yorkers, particularly for low-income New Yorkers. Hazard mitigation funding has historically been based from FEMA on coastal flooding threats, on other flooding threats, and it's pretty difficult to sort of access funding to mitigate the hazard of heat through existing hazard mitigation programs. So we've been working closely with our colleagues at DOHMH to try to figure out how we can fund mitigating the hazard of heat through programs that really historically were developed for flooding. There's a sort of complex benefit cost analysis threshold that has to be met. So we've been working together to develop new methodologies to fit these funding requirements with the goal of combining passive and active cooling strategies for a comprehensive approach. And in general, the idea, as I mentioned, our climate adaptation goals really feed into how can we rehabilitate NYCHA buildings in a way that adapts to our current and future climate conditions, and shifting from a steam heating system to a system that integrates both heating and cooling, complementing that with passive cooling measures like increased vegetation, increased insulation and energy efficiency, is the way that NYCHA is planning to comprehensively address this challenge in the future. So hopefully we'll be seeing some of these modernizations integrate heating and cooling systems, and continue to work to develop those strategies to reduce risk for residents.
Siobhan.
Oh, sorry about that. One final item I want to mention is just that social resilience is a really important part of addressing heat too. Awareness of heat, we're thinking about how we can create partnerships so that as we invest in capital facilities that reduce risk, we also invest in the partnerships and programs that increase awareness and provide things like cooling centers at NYCHA community centers, and potentially creating partnerships that make those as useful as possible during hot weather. So I'll end there. Thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing from the rest of you.
Great, thank you so much, Siobhan. Really appreciate it, and it's really important that NYCHA, it's nice to hear all the things that NYCHA are doing to kind of mitigate extreme heat, because a lot of the NYCHA developments, like you mentioned, are in heat vulnerable areas as well. So we really appreciate that. So we're gonna take a quiet pivot, and we're gonna shift. We technically have two other presenters, but given the time, we wanna take a second. Sono and I are gonna go over what WEACT is doing, and we're gonna present our extreme heat agenda for you guys quickly, and then we'll go back into our presenters. So give me 1 second here. Let me share my screen. For some reason, there we go. Okay. So far as we've heard, quite a bit of information as far as all the health issues that are going on and the disparities that happen around extreme heat. And we've also gotten a taste a little bit of what can be done when we saw Siobhan's presentation about what they're doing in NYCHA to mitigate extreme heat. So what we're gonna go through now is our WEACT's extreme heat plan, and what we think after taking all this research from talking to all these people and working with community members and our members at WEACT, what are some things that we can do that can help mitigate extreme heat. So we come up with the extreme heat policy agenda for this year that's going to be available later on. Everyone will get links to that. We're making a few adjustments to it, but we're going to have that available later on today as well. But basically, we're asking for swift and robust government action to kind of proactively prepare New York City for the rising temperatures and to mitigate any of these health risks that we've talked about. And so there's a lot of different strategies and ways that we can do that. And WEACT has identified 7 objectives that we have. So it's a lot of objectives here, but we're going to kind of go over a few of them. And all of our recommendations kind of fall within 3 major categories. One is affordable cooling options. The other is awareness, communication, and preparedness. And then the last one is green infrastructure and green space. So we're kind of going to go through some of those, and I'm going to have Sono go through those for us. Start with this one.
Thank you, LJ. So our first objective, or a couple of objectives that we have here, are around affordable cooling options. As you heard from our DOH presenters, from Siobhan, from Liv, from everyone, and we will hear more from our other presenters, which we're excited to hear from, is that one of the number one things, the top thing that we can do to combat the health impacts of extreme heat amongst our most vulnerable populations is make sure that people are provided with affordable, accessible, and sustainable cooling options. And so there's a couple ways that we want to do that at WEACT that we're focusing on. That is, I consider it more so a little bit in the short term. So the Low Income Home Energy Assistance Program, as mentioned before, is a program that works like SNAP and WIC, and it provides funding for low income households to get a AC up to an $800 value in the summer months. This is a federal program. It exists in every single state. It's used a little bit differently in different states. Some of the states actually use their money for the cooling portion to subsidize utility bills in the summer months. And that's what we want to see at WEACT. That's what we're asking for in partnership with a lot of the organizations that we work with and the city agencies we work with, is that we really need to see this program be providing some bill subsidies for low income people so that they can run their ACs, because that's what we hear all the time is the biggest barrier to being cool in your home is that it costs too much to run an AC, especially with our electricity rates continuing to go up and going up again. What are we doing to make sure that our vulnerable populations are able to access home cooling? So making sure that there are subsidies for paying utility bills in the summer months is one of the most important immediate steps that we can take. We do hope to see LIHEAP in the long term become a great conduit for putting in more sustainable cooling systems. I know someone mentioned heat pumps in the chat. That is the ultimate goal. That is more the long term. What we want to see is people having more efficient homes that don't need as much energy to cool themselves down, but also have more efficient technologies than our classic New York City window AC units. But those are so important to have now. They are emergency life-saving medical devices that we need to make sure everyone can use and turn on. The next is the cooling center. We will have a full cooling center report for everyone that we'll also be sending out. That is a result of our 2021 cooling center audit project, where WEACT members, I see a couple of you here, so thank you all, go out in the really hot days, heat emergency days in the summer, and see what our New York City cooling centers are looking like in Northern Manhattan. They audited several, I don't remember the exact number, but a couple dozen of them up in Northern Manhattan, finding that there really needs to be better signage. There really needs to be more awareness of cooling centers. They're not being utilized to the extent that they should. Yet we all know that cooling centers is a very, very, very important program to have in New York City, because they are free places for people to go and cool down. They're going to a library, a community center, a senior center, sometimes a classroom to cool down when they're not near their home or they don't have a functioning AC in their home, whatever it might be. They're so important. So our cooling center report contains an assessment of, here are the issues that we're seeing with the program, and here's what our membership and other research has shown us that we need to do to improve the cooling center and make sure more people go. Next. Is this me as well, LJ? I think so. Okay, thank you. We are, then another piece that we have highlighted in our extreme heat agenda is all about communication and awareness and making sure people are prepared for extreme heat. I think we find that although extreme heat is like the #1 weather-related killer, like Katie from the DOH said, there's actually really low risk perception ultimately when it comes to this issue. So how are we making sure that people, the members of the public, particularly our more vulnerable members, are aware that extreme heat truly is a big health risk, and how do they stay safe and how do they access the things that they need to stay safe? This is really, really vital. New York City does a lot of really great work on this. However, we have ideas for how to continue to expand and continue to refine the program to be reaching the most vulnerable populations.
And I got this one, Sonal. So another thing that we are pursuing is that we want to make sure that we are expanding our urban tree canopy, green space, access to parks, and green infrastructure as well. So so we know that green spaces reduce the heat vulnerability index of a neighborhood and reduce the risk associated with the health risk associated with heat waves. And currently, there of the 736 green roofs, there's like the green infrastructure in New York City, only 300 lie, over 300 lie in Midtown and downtown, while the rest are sporadically throughout the city. And so this definitely needs to change in that in the areas where we see the highest heat vulnerability, we should be seeing the most input into expanding our green spaces and utilizing green infrastructure, as you see, like green roofs and like some of the photos up here. The photo on the right is actually the Mother Clara Hale bus depot, which is in Harlem as well, which WEACT has done a lot of work with that as well. That definitely, all the details are on our website for that. So it's really important that we make sure that we're advocating for green space and budget for parks and maintaining these. And we're also supporting the A Million More Trees initiative. And hopefully a lot of those trees go to street trees and trees in areas where there is extreme heat vulnerability, particularly East Harlem, which is one of the hottest areas in New York City. The stretch of 125th Street in East Harlem is practically almost treeless in lots of ways, and it gets extremely hot there in the summer. And one of the things that WEACT does is that we actually do an extreme heat tour in East Harlem. And so everyone who registered and is at this webinar today, we'll send out an invitation for when we do that heat tour later in the summer as well, and see if anyone's interested in taking that heat tour. It's really informative, and it really just kind of makes everything that we're talking about today really kind of visceral, and kind of that we understand the impact that extreme heat has disproportionately throughout the city. So again, that report will be available later on today, the extreme heat agenda, and there's going to be 7 objectives, and there's so many recommendations, a lot of great ones. So we hope that everyone kind of goes through, looks through it, reads for it, and then reach out to us if you want to help us advocate for any of those issues that we're going to be working on this summer. So we're going to transition back, and I'm going to ask Daphne Lundy from the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice to talk a little bit about what the city is doing right now to kind of combat extreme heat.
Thanks, Lonnie, and thanks to the WEACT crew for organizing this very timely conversation. I'm just going to try to share my screen. Let's see. Can folks see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So hi, everyone. My name is Daphne Lundy. I'm with the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice. A lot of my work tends to focus on extreme heat because my team is involved in thinking about public spaces, streets, how we can use those spaces to help address urban heat island effect. So I'll be talking about Cool Neighborhoods NYC, which is the city's heat plan, but then I'll also be talking about the other initiatives that we've been trying to do to address heat risk. So Cool Neighborhoods NYC is the city's heat resiliency plan. And it actually came out a number of years ago in 2017. And there are a lot of elements to it, so I won't go through all of the pieces. But the primary function of the report was to think about ways we could be targeting programs and investments in the neighborhoods we know where people experience heat risk the most, and where there are higher chances of things like heat mortality and heat illness and stroke. So, as folks have said before, for many reasons, Black and brown neighborhoods are the ones that face the greatest risk when it comes to extreme heat. This is due to racist housing policy like redlining. This is due to lack in investments in things like green space and other things. And so the report has really focused on prioritizing initiatives to the people that need it the most. So a big part of this work has been trying to sort of refill the tree canopy in neighborhoods that never had it. So, as Liv mentioned earlier, a lot of the same neighborhoods that were redlined are neighborhoods today where people are facing risk. Redlining not only determined where people were able to get mortgages, but it was also an indicator of where investments were or were not made. And so the same neighborhoods where it was harder to get a mortgage if you're Black or brown are the same neighborhoods where there were fewer investments in things like open space, tree canopy, et cetera. And so through Cool Neighborhoods, we've been working to build out the tree canopy in the areas that need it the most. And this is not work where we're able to sort of reap the benefits immediately. You plant a tree today, you don't feel the benefits today, but over time it helps to increase the tree canopy and address urban heat island effect in the neighborhoods that feel it the most. So another big part of the work that we've been doing around extreme heat has been around building social cohesion and social resilience in the neighborhoods where it's really critical. So, besides the physical interventions that we can be doing, we know through a lot of research the power of social resilience in building networks, in helping people know what to do or where to go during a heat wave. And so Be a Buddy has been a really critical part of our heat strategy. And this is a program where we've partnered with 3 community-based organizations in heat vulnerable neighborhoods. In East Harlem, we partner with Union Settlement, and these CBOs are trained in a range of things around climate preparedness. And when there's a heat wave, they're activated and know to either call or reach out to people who might be socially isolated or who might have trouble accessing information. And they are conduits to share information about cooling centers or to encourage neighbors to turn on air conditioning or even encourage neighbors to apply for things like heat and other services that the city provides. And what we found with these types of networks is that they're not only critical during heat waves, but they've also been really critical during the COVID pandemic that we're in. So, a lot of our partners were able to activate at the early months or in the early months of the pandemic, and they were able to connect neighbors to things like the Get Food program, which provided free food to folks. They were also able to connect people to the Get Cool program, which was AC, which was getting ACs to people who needed it. And so it's really proving that social networks and social cohesion isn't just something that's critical for climate disasters and climate hazards, but it's also the type of work that's important for all types of, emergency preparedness and, sort of dealing with the many disasters and crises that we face in a city. So every summer, we also do a number of workshops with NYCHA, which is the Emergency Management Office. And at the start of heat season, we oftentimes do workshops that are geared towards residents or people that are in CBOs that provide information on how to access the heat program, how to recognize the signs of things like heat stroke or heat illness. And it's really a way for us to share critical emergency preparedness information with folks. If you haven't already signed up for the NYCHA newsletter, it's one of the links in the back of my deck, and I'll drop it in the chat as well. But it's a really helpful way to stay abreast of the different types of workshops that are available, whether it's tied to heat or other hazards that we face in the city. So another big thing that we've been working on is trying to upgrade our built environment and make interventions in our built environment to address heat. So, one of the things that we've been running for quite a number of years is the Cool Roofs program. So this is a program that provides free white roof coatings to affordable housing developments, community facilities, with a particular focus on buildings that are in high heat vulnerable areas. So, as people have explained with the HVI map, the darker orange areas are the areas that have that greatest heat vulnerability. And so over the past 10 years, we've been targeting these white roofs to those same neighborhoods. And the benefit of Cool Roofs is that they not only help to decrease indoor temperatures, but they can also help to address things like energy efficiency by helping buildings need to use less energy in the summer months by cooling down temperatures. So another program that's been talked about heavily already is the Home Energy Assistance Program. So this is a program that's been in the city for quite some time. It's a program where you're able to either get money for the purchase or installation of a fan or an air conditioner. Through the pandemic, we've been able to make a lot of sort of advocacy to make changes to the program, really in partnership with folks like WeAct and other organizations. And so since the pandemic, there have been a lot of critical changes that hopefully lower the barriers for applying. So currently, if you want to apply for the program for the summer, medical documentation is no longer required. If you live in subsidized housing or receive a Section 8 voucher, you can also apply. That was a really critical change. And then starting this past month in May, the application is now available online. So if you have an Access HRA account, whether it's through your phone or through online on a computer, you can now apply for the cooling assistance program through that. And because this is a federal program, we're also still trying to push for more through this program. So, as folks have mentioned, we want to see a utility assistance component to this program. Other states already do this. So for example, New Jersey already has this in their heat program. And so that's the type of changes that we're still advocating for on the state and the federal level. And then another thing I wanted to highlight was the Cool at NYC map that Lonnie mentioned. So if you go to the NYC Parks website, you can look up an address and it will point you to the direction of the shadiest blocks in your neighborhood or places like parks or open space that have sprinklers or water fountains, but basically trying to guide people towards places in public space that are cooler or where they can seek respite when it's really hot outside. And really the core guiding principle for cool neighborhoods and a lot of our heat resiliency work has been to guide investments in the neighborhoods that need it the most. So, as we're thinking about places to increase green infrastructure or thinking about places where we want to see more green roofs and cool roofs, it's really trying to target it to the highest heat vulnerable neighborhoods as a way to address these, long histories of inequality in policy and investment in the city. So, another thing that we're really focused on is thinking about the role of public spaces and streets as spaces of respite. Because of COVID, a lot of the traditional cooling avenues that we had, whether it was, going to a friend's house or going to a cooling center wasn't available. And so I think now more than ever, we realize the value of public spaces. And we also realize how critical they are when we're thinking about ways to address heat. So, things like access to green space or things like vegetation in a public space can really drive how we experience streets or public spaces as pedestrians or as people sort of, experiencing the city in general. So these are just some links to programs that I mentioned briefly, and I'm going to turn it to Louise, who's going to talk some more about the work that we've been doing around streets and extreme heat.
Thank you so much, Daphne. We'll make sure everyone gets these links to the chat as well. And we are going to bring up Luis, our last presenter, and last but not least for sure. I know we're running really close to time. So Luis, we really do appreciate you coming in still presenting to us. But she's the city's chief climate officer at the Comptroller's office.
There we go, I'm unmuted. Thank you, Lonnie, and thanks, Daphne, for teeing me up. I'm excited to be the first ever Chief Climate Officer to serve at the Office of the Controller, and I think I'm an appropriate closer because our office plays a unique role as an independent oversight and accountability arm of the city. We manage various risks facing the city, including climate risks, and among our various climate functions, we are the custodian of New York City's pension funds, and are proud to be the only large public pension fund to divest from fossil fuels and make proactive investments in the kinds of climate solutions that we want to see more of, which is our literal way of putting our money where our mouth is. So we have other functions in providing data transparency, auditing, policy and budget analysis to keep our city accountable to our climate goals of having a more equitable, resilient, and sustainable city with a just transition to a green economy that really centers and prioritizes frontline communities. I won't talk about this long because I think it's been well covered by my co-panelists, but the data shows that our summers are getting hotter and our heat waves are becoming more frequent and severe. So I'm going to really focus on an initiative that I worked on with Daphne and the mayor's chief technology office last summer while I was still at the Department of Transportation. And so as my co-panelists are talking about, long racist housing and investment policies have really affected our built environment and had implications for heat vulnerability, especially in Black and Brown communities today. So we specifically wanted to zoom into this question of how does streetscape design affect temperature? We ran a pilot program to deploy real-time heat sensors that assess the different drivers of heat impacts that Daphne just outlined in her presentation in 4 medium to high heat vulnerable neighborhoods in Boring Hill, Brownsville, Crown Heights, and Hunts Point, and identified locations within them that were in fully sunny areas with little or no vegetative cover to partially shaded and fully shaded areas with high vegetative cover. And so we picked multiple locations within each of these 4 neighborhoods. And overall, we did find statistical significance in the temperature across these different shade and streetscape typologies. We saw the biggest temperature difference on heat advisory days that exceeded 90 degrees, which helped indicate that shade was especially effective at cooling as temperatures became more extreme. We also found that on heat advisory days, sustained exposure to 90-degree temperatures lasted for 6 to 7 hours. And these findings were most starkly seen on Tiffany Street Plaza in Hunts Point, where half the block had these big shade trees and an outdoor cooling center, partly sponsored by DOHMH, while the other half of the block had no street trees and was fully exposed to sun. And we saw consistently 10 degrees temperature differences on those extreme heat days. So quickly, a few takeaways from the pilot. First, I'm hopeful that data like this and others shared here can provide performance-based measurements of the benefits of heat-resilient infrastructure design. Not just trees, but also artificial or temporary shade structures, roadway paving materials, building materials. And I'm so glad that Siobhan from NYCHA mentioned the benefit cost analysis issue with FEMA hazard mitigation programs. And as she highlighted, the methodologies for demonstrating heat mitigation benefits are so underdeveloped. Last year at DOT, I worked with Daphne to help secure the first FEMA grant for heat mitigation in the country. It was us and King County in Seattle were the first 2 ever awarded, and are looking to design heat resiliency streetscape standards for DOT. So with more major investments coming down the pike from the federal infrastructure bill, I really hope that this kind of data can help bring attention and funding to make meaningful investments in heat resiliency. And last, the differences that we found in these streetscape types really emphasize the importance of localized real-time heat data as a powerful way to equip New Yorkers to understand their own risks, as well as to advocate and sort of like democratize data collection so that communities can advocate for better heat resiliency solutions of our city agencies. So as I mentioned, our office is excited to use our tools to provide oversight and accountability in terms of data tracking and transparency, program evaluation. We created a climate dashboard with the link here, and I can put it in the chat. It's an interactive tool that tracks our progress in reducing our carbon footprint and greening our grid and making resilient investments. And I'm excited to hear ideas from all of you and partner with EJ communities to use the tools of our office in a way that can hold our city accountable together. So I saw someone in the chat earlier had an idea about heat on subway platforms, which would be a cool thing for us to explore further. So please feel free to reach out. Please think of our office as a resource for climate action. And I'll end there to be mindful of time.
Thank you so much, Louise. That was very informative and very quick, and I think I really appreciate you being mindful of time. I know we are at time, but we are joined by Councilmember Lincoln Ressler. So if he wants to come on real quick and say a few words about extreme heat, the floor is yours.
I really appreciate it. Thank you, LJ, and everyone at WEACT. And that was a great presentation. I just am so appreciative of you all laying out such a crisp example of how the climate crisis is upon us and the extreme heat that we're experiencing in our neighborhoods already this year is of grave concern. And we need actionable steps to organize around, to legislate around, to invest in. And I'm so appreciative of of the leadership of WEAC to help us make that happen. And I am consistently amazed by just how miraculous trees are, and we are doing everything we can to try to plant more trees in our community to not just improve our air quality, but to bring temperatures down. We've actually put together a climate action plan for District 33 for ways in which we're looking to drive down emissions from our largest sources and create more green spaces and green infrastructure and realize a more resilient community. And how we tackle extreme heat is a central part to it. So I really just want to thank WEAC for the exceptional work you do, and it's wonderful to be with you all, and look forward to listening for the remainder of the session and continuing to learn and to partner with you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Councilmember Ressler. Well, we are actually at the end of this webinar and presentation. I know we could probably go on for hours talking about extreme heat and all the things that we want to do with it, but I'm glad that everyone got a taste of what's going on around the city and what's being advocated for, especially here at WEAC. And we look forward to working with all the city agencies and council members like Councilmember Ressler on kind of mitigating extreme heats and the effects of it. Sonal, I'll let you have the last word since you are the Director of Policy and Queen of all things extreme heat.
Thanks, LJ. I'm happy to have you have the last word since you organized this amazing webinar. This went so well. I learned so much. I hope everyone else did. Thank you so much to all of our speakers for joining, and thank you to Councilmember Ressler. And we noted there's many other staff members of other legislators in the city and the state that joined us. So thank you all for coming today, and we look forward to working with all of you in the future on extreme heat. Thank you all.
Thank you. And we'll definitely send out the recording and all the links and the presentations so you guys can all review and have all that information. All right. So everyone enjoy the rest of your day and stay cool when it gets hot.
Thank you, Lonnie.